Yimmy in my basement, Oshun in my pipes, no trust fund in the 215.
Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm Alex Ames, and this is Season 1, Books and Bitters, Adventures in Book Collecting, in which we explore the stories behind fascinating objects in the Rosenbach's collection and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day life. This episode is titled The View from Windsor, a conversation about rare books and stewarding national heritage with Rachel Scott of Royal Collection Trust. In this episode, we're making a return trip to the Royal Library to talk with one of the librarians who helps manage the collection that is now held in trust by Her Majesty the Queen for her successors and the nation. Today, I want to discuss what role historic artifacts like rare books, manuscripts, art, and antiques play in the life of a nation, and why they matter to the health of our culture. I hope that this episode might also whet your appetite to pay your own visit to Windsor Castle, which is open to the public for tours, including for American visitors. We'll have more information about that at the end of the program. My guest today is well positioned to help us explore the connections between rare books, manuscripts, art, and statecraft. Rare book historian Rachel Scott works as Collections Information Assistant at Royal Collection Trust and is based at the Royal Library in Windsor Castle. Royal Collection Trust looks after the Royal Collection, which is one of the most important art collections in the world, and manages the public opening of the official residences of Her Majesty the Queen. Comprising almost all aspects of the fine and decorative arts and running to more than 1 million objects, the Royal Collection is a unique and valuable record of the personal tastes of kings and queens over the past 500 years. Rachel's academic interests are the history of Hebrew and Bible printing, the history of children's books, and women in book history. Ironically enough, all three of these areas of academic focus connect to the small volume previously found in the Royal Library collection that was gifted to Dr. Rosenbach in 1924, which I discussed on the last episode of the Rosenbach Podcast. And in fact, this little book helped me and Rachel get to know each other several years ago. While on a Rosenbach Art Courier trip to London back in 2018, I contacted the Royal Library about coming for a research visit, both to investigate an important volume in the collection and, I will admit, to reenact Dr. Rosenbach's memorable afternoon spent at the castle. Rachel gave me an introduction to the collection. We've stayed in touch since then, and I'm so delighted to have this conversation today. Thank you, Rachel, for joining me on the Rosenbach Podcast.
Thank you so much for asking me to be on this podcast. It's so lovely to discuss books and book history.
Rachel, my understanding is that the Royal Collection is one division within the larger royal household. Can you explain to me how you operate within the wider household context?
Yes, so the Royal Collection Trust is one of the departments within the royal household. The Trust cares for and manages the art collection of the monarchy, which, as you have said, houses a whole range of items from books and manuscripts, paintings to works of art on paper, photographs, decorative arts such as Fabergé. We have a couple of Fabergé eggs. We're also known for having a large number of Leonardo's drawings. The Royal Collection Trust also runs and manages the sites that are open to the public, such as Windsor Castle, Holyrood Palace, which is the Queen's official residence in Scotland, and this is in Edinburgh, and the opening of Buckingham Palace in the summer, where visitors pre-COVID could visit the state rooms. We also have two galleries, which we manage. They're both called the Queen's Gallery. One is in London, which is situated next to Buckingham Palace. It was actually originally the chapel for the royal family in Buckingham Palace, but it got hit during the Blitz. And so it was decided to turn that into a gallery to show items from the royal collection. And then the second Queen's Gallery is in Edinburgh, which is next to Holyrood Palace. We put on exhibitions and display items from the collection to help them make them accessible to the public. In recent years, we've had exhibitions displaying our Indian and Persian manuscripts. We've had one exhibition displaying and exploring the connection between the Romanovs and the British royal family, as well as splendours of George IV, watercolours by Queen Victoria, and a Smash Leonardo exhibition to celebrate 500 years of his life.
Tell me a bit about the history of the Royal Library.
The current Royal Library was founded by William IV, who is the uncle of Queen Victoria. It was founded in the 1830s. The previous two libraries were gifted to the nation, first of all by George II in 1757. This collection is known as the Old Royal Library and is now housed in the British Library. And then the second Royal Library was gifted to the nation by George IV in 1827. This is also in the British Library and is known as the King's Library. This mostly makes up of George III's scholarly library that was in Buckingham House, which is now known as Buckingham Palace. So, the current Royal Library is housed in a suite of 3 rooms, and we're very, very creative with the naming of our rooms. Room 1 used to be the bedroom of Catherine of Braganza, who was Charles II's wife. It's just off the staterooms, and the wardens, the tour guides, are often asked, "We've seen the King's bedroom, but where's the Queen's bedroom?" It's now one of our rooms. Room 2 is actually part of a Tudor structure, this Tudor part of the castle, and was originally Henry VII's bedroom. One of our curators, when we do have visitors, if we feel it's appropriate, does enjoy teasing and joking that this is probably the room Henry VIII was conceived in. Just off room 2 is a little turret. This is known as the Queen Anne closet. This is reportedly where Queen Anne was sat with her favourite, the Duchess of Marlborough, when they received a letter from the Duchess of Marlborough's husband, the Duke of Marlborough, that they had won the Battle of Blenheim. If you've seen The Favourite, this film starts with Queen Anne presenting the Duchess of Marlborough with a model of Blenheim Palace. This is the room where they discovered they'd won this battle. And room 3, like I said, we are very original with the namings of our room, was originally built for Elizabeth I as an indoor walking gallery. She used to enjoy taking exercise and walking to help stimulate her mind, and she built the terrace that you can visit in Windsor Castle, and she used to walk up and down there. However, with the big Elizabethan ride dresses, when it was windy, it was felt it was unsafe for her to walk on this terrace, so they built her an indoor walking gallery. And we enjoy joking that we can almost feel her spirit of her walking up and down this room, barking orders at her politicians and her aides while she's trying to think. What we all love about this room as well is it still has the original Elizabethan fireplace, with what we consider very friendly, slightly shocked looking lions. And we've actually taken this lion to use as the book plate for the Royal Library. Prince Albert was highly influential in the development of the library. Prince Albert was the husband and Prince Consort of Queen Victoria. With the help of his librarian, Bernard Woodward, he reordered the library within a year. Previously, it had been ordered by size, which is a highly efficient way of organising books. You get far more books in, but it wasn't catalogued. So, in his very organised way, he had it ordered in a far more sensible manner, and he actually removed the false ceiling that had been in room 2. He added a mezzanine to it, and then had a mock Tudor looking ceiling added to it. One of our favourite questions when people come into libraries asking, what age do you think our ceiling is? Everyone instantly responds with, it's Tudor. It's clearly not, though, because Prince Albert added the coat of arms of Queen Victoria and himself to the ceiling, so it could not be mistaken for being the original ceiling. We have a lot of books that belong to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the library. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert used to read to each other, and this was a beloved evening pastime. One of the books that we have was the book Queen Victoria read to Prince Albert as he lay dying. It was a copy of Sir Walter Scott, Percival of the Peak. The last line she ever read to him was, he looked towards the table he had left. The tapers seemed to become hazy and dim as he gazed. He heard the sound of voices, but they ceased to convey any impression to his understanding, and in a few minutes he was faster asleep than he had ever been in the whole course of his life. There is a slip of mourning paper glued into this page. Mourning paper is paper that has a black rim around it, and Queen Victoria inscribed in the front. This book was read up to the mark in page 81 to my beloved husband during his fatal illness and within 3 days of its terrible termination. December 14, 1861. VR.
That was such a beautiful quote, Rachel. Thank you for sharing it. Rachel, you've already said quite a bit about some of the items that you hold in the library collection. Give me a sense of the composition of the Royal Library's collection today. What are some of the strengths in your holdings?
Some of the items that we have, or some of our key strengths, are we have just over 200 incunables. These are books printed before 1500. Incunable or incunable comes from the Latin, which translates roughly as from the cradle of print. One of these is actually one of 10 surviving copies of the Mind Psalter. This was the second book ever printed, and it's the first book to be printed in red and black. It has a fine purple velvet binding that was bound for George III, and actually it's a book Rosenbach talks about in his book, and talks about the excitement of being able to see it in the Royal Library when he met the librarian, John Fortescue. We also have a number of books printed by William Caxton, which I believe you have a number of. You have 14 Caxtons? William Caxton was the first printer in England. He had been a diplomat and a merchant. He'd spent time in the Low Countries, and he saw books were becoming more popular. They were becoming more affordable, and he thought this would be a good business to get into. So he learned the art of printing and returned with his assistant, Vinken de Verd, and he set up a print shop in Westminster. And Caxton predominantly printed in English, and he predominantly printed books that would be popular. He's famous for printing Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Aesop's Fables, amongst others. We also have a number of illuminated manuscripts. We're strong in our Asian and Southeast Asian, so Persian and Indian manuscripts. And possibly quite surprisingly, we have a lot of travel guides from the Victorian period. The Royal Library is there to support the monarchy. And during the Victorian times, railways were allowing people to travel more. And so what might be surprising to know is we actually have a number of Victorian travel guides. And this was partly due to the expansion of the railways, and also to allow Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to better know the country of Britain, so that if they needed to know exactly everything about somewhere someone came from in order to make polite conversation, they could read up. This is during a time where there was no internet, so how would you know about different parts of the country? Therefore, they bought a lot of travel guides.
How are the library space and its wonderful collections utilized today?
So our collection is used in a couple of different ways. As I've said, we are there to support the monarchy. So we do help and do diplomatic displays for functions. We also use our books in exhibitions. We had the Persian and Asian manuscript exhibition. We contributed books to George IV exhibition. So they are used in that way. We also allow researchers access, much like yourself, if there's a good reason for them needing access.
Rachel, in the last episode of the Rosenbach Podcast, I shared Dr. Rosenbach's recollections of spending an afternoon in the Royal Library, enjoying the books and admiring the views. What's it like to work in Windsor Castle today? And I have to ask, does the sense of awe and wonder ever truly wear off when you're walking through these historic spaces and working with these rare artifacts?
No, it's magical. The sense of awe and wonder doesn't wear off. The view Rosenbach actually describes is still very much the same. My office view is the view Rosenbach describes. I sit at my desk and I look out over the River Thames and I can see the spires of Eton College, which he also mentions. It's a very old historic school in Britain. I love the train ride to work, especially in the winter, as the sun is just coming up and it's all misty. The train curves away from Windsor and then it curves back round and the castle just comes into view. And it rises up like Camelot, rising up from the mists. It's a truly magical view, seeing the spires and the turrets rise up from this misty, cold winter's morning. It's nothing short of magical. I don't think it's possible to ever stop wondering at the sight of walking up the hill in the castle past St. George's Chapel, which is more like a mini cathedral, then up past round the Round Tower. I don't think the sense of awe ever really wears off. My job takes me in so many of the different royal residences. I never stop wandering in awe, wandering along the picture gallery in Buckingham Palace. And just there's a Vermeer, Van Dyck, Rembrandt's, Caravaggio's, a Rubens. Or walking into a room and seeing a display of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings there to be studied or for display or being prepared for a loan. Being asked to help move Fabergé objects into a semi-state room. The artwork is incredible. The history, you can sense it. You can't help but feel the buildings ooze history. Knowing, for instance, George III was held towards the end of his life during one of the periods of his illness in one of the rooms connected to the library. I was discussing this with one of my colleagues who's worked here for 40 years. I was saying to her, do you still get a sense of awe and wonderment at what you do? And she was very honest. Like, yes, I still, to this day, I get shivers up my spine. I love it when people walk into the library for the first time and see their faces light up. Even seeing people wandering around the castle, it fills me with joy, seeing their faces look up at this amazing architecture. I don't think it's possible for that feeling to ever go away.
What's a typical day at work like for you? What kinds of tasks do you do with the books and other materials in the collection?
That's a very, very, very good question. I sometimes wish I knew what a typical day at work is like. The wall collection is a working collection, so it's not like your typical museum collection. So it can be highly varied, and no 2 days are truly ever the same. My desk chair was bought and has the mark on the bottom from Queen Victoria's reign. My office clock was George III's 21st birthday present. It's unlike any other job I've had. I can be asked to do anything from catalogue books, which is what I thought I would be doing, to potentially help moving some furniture. Everything is part of a functioning estate, so I could end up down in conservation studios. I can be in state rooms. The collection is there to support the monarchy and the Queen as head of state. So I can have a day planned out, and that day can go how I expected it, or something happens or someone needs a hand, and that plan for the day can go completely out of the window. This is an institution that's over 1,000 years old, and the castle is over 1,000 years old. I really would like to know what a typical day at work is like for myself at times.
As far as Judaica and Hebraica are concerned, what kinds of collections objects does the Royal Library hold? I'm particularly interested in this, seeing as the little book that Dr. Rosenbach received years ago from the Royal Library fits within our Judaica holdings at the Rosenbach.
So we do have some Hebraica items. So during lockdown, we actually noticed that we had a printing of the Talmud by Daniel Bomberg. This is such a fantastic find, and it truly is a special book. It's the first time the Talmud's printed in its entirety. It was issued previously as pamphlets, and the typography is just beautiful. It's iconic almost. When Bomberg's press finished, the type that was used was actually sold to Plantain. So Christopher Plantain was a 16th century printer in Antwerp. So this type went from Venice to Antwerp because it's so iconic. And I'm so excited to do more work on this Bomberg Talmud. It's also fascinating to notice that a number of our books that are in Hebrew were actually given to Queen Victoria as gifts, and sort of discussed this with a couple of colleagues, and from my own knowledge, I think this is possibly to do with the pogroms that happened, and they were given as gifts for allowing Jewish immigrants in and to settle in Britain as part of thanks. We have a number of prayer books and little books on rabbinic law. Another item that has bits of Hebrew in, but used in a very interesting way, was actually the item you, Alex, came to visit and research, the Little Giddens Concordance. And it was put together by a sort of fringe Christian group in the sort of first half of the 1600s, and it's possibly made for Charles I. And this community, as sort of a religious practice, cut and paste different bits from books and various printings as a form of devotion. And this has got Hebrew throughout it.
Rachel, do you have a favorite item in the Royal Library collection? What is it, and why is it your favorite?
Can I have more than one? Thank you. Thank goodness. As you can probably guess, I'm very fond of Purview of the Peak, that I've mentioned earlier on, by Sir Walter Scott. I'm very much an early modern and medieval historian. And before starting here, I would have been quite open and saying I thought Queen Victoria and the Victorian period was very prudish and not particularly interesting. But this job has really challenged me in my view of Queen Victoria. And this book is one of the books that really challenged how I viewed Queen Victoria. She wasn't just a prudish baby-making monarch. She was a woman who truly loved her husband to pieces. And he was not, as I think, not a controlling person. He really wanted to make a difference, and you can see that through the books they were giving each other. She gave him a very beautiful copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and he gave her a copy of Tennyson's The Princess, which is about women receiving an education. And this was at a time when Britain, women couldn't get an education. And Queen Victoria actually went on to be connected to the first institution in London that would allow women to gain a university level education. What I love about Perville and the Peak is that she noted where she got up to. And I just find that a really touching thing to do. The second book I love is the Bomberg Talmud. It's got so far a really interesting history, and I'm looking forward to researching it more. It's the first time a Talmud was printed in its entirety. The different sections had been issued as pamphlets previously. And Bomberg's typography actually became iconic when he ended. It was sold to Plantain in Antwerp. And to me, it's beautiful type. The design is just stunning. It's exquisite. And Bomberg's a huge reason why I became fascinated in Hebrew book history. So to have this in the library to research is a dream come true. My last book I love is a Caxton's printing, who I've already mentioned Caxton, and it's by the medieval writer Christine de Pizan. The copy we have is She Lived in France, and the English title is The Book of Deeds and Good Morals for the Rise King Charles V. French King Charles. And I think she's such a fascinating character in history. Her father, Thomas de Pizzino, was an astronomer and medical man in Bologna, and he was being sort of courted by two of the royal courts, and he ended up in the French royal court as the astronomer and medicine. And he strongly believed women should have the same education as the man. So Christine was brought up and had the same education as her two brothers, whilst at the same time had to have a women's education. Part of me feels really sorry. It feels like sometimes she had to do 2 lots of schooling. She got married at 13, which is mind-boggling how young that is, to one of the scribes in the royal court. And he seemed to have had a similar outlook as her father, and he actually continued her education. So she really was one of the first women to be educated to almost the equivalent of university level. She had 2 sons and a daughter, and rather sadly, her husband died when she was about 18. They kind of lose her in history books for about 10 years. It's presumed she's working as a scribe, but it is known that she has to support herself, her 2 children, her mother, and parts of her husband's family. That's a lot of responsibility to take on as an 18-year-old. She reemerges about 28 as a writer, and I find it very interesting what she's writing about. She gets involved with a quarrel with 2 of the king's most senior aides over a text called Romance de la Rose, Romance of the Rose. is highly misogynistic. The Rose, the woman, is written about is horrible. And she writes and calls out these senior aides. This would be almost an equivalent in America as the president's chief of staff. She's calling misogynistic. She's saying, if you think this is a good book, you have questionable morals. And from this, the king commissions her to write a book, the Book of the City of Ladies, and it's an instructional book and is known as a catalogue of women. It's not as bad as it sounds. It's listing and explaining good women throughout history and what have women contributed to, highlighting women from classical literature, from mythology, from the Bible. And she's also the writer of the only contemporary account we have of Joan of Arc, and a poem Christine de Pizan wrote. And France was in trouble. It was having battles with England. And Christine de Pizan and people at the time believed that a man got France into trouble, it'll take a woman to get France out of trouble. And I just find her writings and her life absolutely fascinating. And the fact we've got this text printed by Caxton, who was the first printer in Britain, who once again has beautiful typography. The design of the type is so distinct. And I'm slightly fond that he has an assistant who, I believe I pronounce it wrong, but as I read it, is Vinken de Verd. I just think that's a fantastic name for a printer.
I should certainly say so. Prior to our conversation today, Rachel, I shared some photos with you of that little book that Dr. Rosenbach received from the Royal Library collection years ago. It's bound in velvet with beautiful embroidery. Do you have other books bound in a similar fashion in the Royal Library's collection? And does the library continue to accession new volumes that are presented by authors to the monarch?
It really is a beautiful binding. Oh, it's lovely. It really is. We do actually have something similar, but they won't have been influenced. The one that we have is a binding that's on a book presented to Charles II. He was born in 1630 and died in 1685, where the book you presented is a more Victorian book, so clearly they're not particularly connected. But our Charles II book, it's got this beautiful velvet and gold embroidered binding. And the book you have was presented by a women's organisation. And I think they were wanting to show off how good the needlework was and how exquisite the binding of the book was. Your binding is, we'd probably say in the library, scrummy. It's lovely. So yes, we still receive items. We receive items as state gifts as well as sort of items deposited and gifted by the poet laureates. However, we do not actively collect. The role is more about caring for the collection that we have, maintaining it, and making sure that it survives for the next generation to look after and care for.
Tell me a bit about what it's like to visit Windsor Castle as a tourist. What can listeners who might want to come to the castle on a public tour expect to see and learn?
If you visit Windsor Castle, you will learn about the history of the monarchy and learn more about the history of this beautiful, beautiful castle. You'll see some exquisite artwork, some beautiful historic interiors, just shiny, gold, fabulous. You'll see some really historic rooms, and hopefully from some of these historic rooms you might even see the view that we've been discussing today that Rosenbach himself saw, out over Windsor, over the Thames, and in the spires of Eton College. It's magical. You'd have a magical day. You can go and see St. George's Chapel, which I've mentioned, and see the guards marching around and just get to soak in the history. It drips history. You can feel the history oozing out of the walls.
Finally, to close out our interview, Rachel, what do you find most meaningful about your work? As you're leaving the castle grounds after a day in the office, what makes you feel best about the work that you do?
I work in a wonderful office with an amazing collection, with some of the kindest people I've ever met. All I've wanted to do was care and catalogue for books, and make sure the next generation gets to work with them and care for them. So I leave my job each day feeling so satisfied that I get to do what I've wanted to do for years, and in such an amazing environment is incredible.
Rachel, I really can't thank you enough for sharing so many insights into your work at the Royal Library and for offering us a glimpse into the world of rare books at Windsor Castle. I've loved this opportunity to learn about your experiences and very much look forward to sharing this conversation with the Rosenbach's audience here in the United States and around the world.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. If you feel inspired to plan your own transatlantic adventure like that of Dr. Rosenbach that Rachel and I discussed, please know that Windsor Castle is open to the public for tours. Just visit www.rct.uk/visit/Windsor-Castle. The Royal Library itself is not a part of the tour, but there is of course much else to see and enjoy. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, literature, and culture on the Rosenbach Podcast. Upcoming episodes of the Rosenbach Podcast will continue our exploration of the Rosenbach Collection's transatlantic connections, focusing on Dr. Rosenbach's volunteer work around the time of the Second World War. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope that you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. Thank you for your support. If you enjoy the introductory and concluding music featured on the podcast, which was composed and performed by Rosenbach Board of Directors member Yolanda Wisher and her band, the Afro Eaters, and was recorded at WRTI 90.1 in Philadelphia for NPR live sessions, visit WRTI.org to learn more. Also, please consider purchasing Yolanda Wisher's new album. Just visit rosenbach.org for information. The Rosenbach Podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. I look forward to continuing our conversation on the next episode of the Rosenbach Podcast.
Give me eye in my basement, ocean in my pipes, no trust fund in the 215.